We have the privilege of talking with today, and then we'll turn to the orientation. Our first lecturer today is going to be Professor Jedediah Purdy, who graduated from Harvard with an A.B. in Social Studies and received his J.D. from Yale Law School. And he teaches constitutional, environmental, and property law and writes in all of these different areas. And he clerked for the Honorable Pierre N. Laval of the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New York City, and has been a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School, an ethics fellow at Harvard University, and a visiting professor at Yale Law School as well as Harvard. And his scholarship covers a wide range of issues. He's published in the Yale Law Journal, University of Chicago Law Review, the Duke Law Journal, Cornell, Harvard Environmental Law Review, and he is the author of 4 books, including a trilogy on American political identity, which concluded with the 2009 book, A Tolerable Anarchy, all from the very large publisher Knopf. And he has a real public intellectual side to him. He's published many essays in the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times op-ed page and book review, Die Zeit in Germany, and Democracy Journal. And his most recent, The Meaning of Property, appeared in 2010 from Yale Press, and very relevant to us today, he's at work on American Environmental Imagination, which is under contract with Harvard University Press. And I would just add a personal note that I am writing a book on the idea of the common space between religious communities and universities in my own field. And I came across his early book on the common good and the idea of the common good, and how we think about irony and the public sphere in today's world. And I found it really an inspiring, a wonderful book. And I did not return it to my former library. I kept it close to me until it was wrested away from me only a week ago. So now I'm going to have to actually purchase the book, Mr. Purdy. So I think that's good for him. So, yeah, maybe he'll give me one. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Jedediah Purdy. And before you start, we're going to do the introductions. Yeah. And then the second person we have here today is Michelle Nolan, who's a senior lecturing fellow and supervising attorney for the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. She joined us in 2008 as in her present capacity, and she supervises students from the law school and the Nicholas School of the Environment who work in the clinic, and she also co-teaches the seminar portion of the clinic. She has really dedicated a career to the protection of natural resources and public health through the actual practice of environmental law. She joined the Southern Environmental Law Center in Chapel Hill in 1995 after completing a fellowship awarded by the Ford Foundation and 2 years in private practice. And for the next 13 years, she represented nonprofit environmental and community organizations throughout the Southeast on a wide variety of issues. She's read SELC's Hog Industry Project and helped develop state laws and the first comprehensive regulatory programs for factory hog farms in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. She's worked on the Clean Water Act and worked on helping states make better environmental decisions, as well as groundbreaking settlements between states and agricultural corporations to study and develop new technologies to manage, treat, and utilize waste from factory farms. Basically, all the practical stuff that there's environmental engagement around. Michelle has been able to address it with her legal training, so please join me in welcoming Michelle. So for a little bit of orientation before we turn to Professor Purdy, I want to continue to remind us not only of where we've been, where we're going, and why this university course matters in new and interesting ways every week. Last week, we really began to think about food and the relationship between industrialization and the agrarian vision of our founding mothers and fathers, with Professor Wurzbach's lecture, as well as Professor Holland's lecture and Sam Himmel's comments. And one of the things that came up is how do we only read those foundational documents in an agrarian kind of way? And why do those agrarian foundational documents even matter in what we have been thinking about for today to the post-American world? And reminder that Fareed Zakaria, the author of that, is going to be this year's graduation speaker at Duke, so very interesting. I wanted to remind you of that. But the important thing here might be the question that we'd all want to ask, which is, how does pre-industrial life actually compare with industrial? And can industrial life make itself into something better? And we're going to hear from a number of lecturers later on in the class who take that position in some very provocative ways. So that's the first point about last week. Second point is that we heard also from a theologian farmer, Norman, who called for an ethic based on husbandry and community. And Wendell Berry influencing both last week's speaker and this week's thinking as well. And thinking about that theme of marriage as a metaphor for understanding human relationships to land. And Berry has written on marriage itself in a number of other contexts as well. And Professor Holland and Words both showed us how race could play into that question of ownership history, particularly in terms of Native American history of land use. And Sam Hummel really pushed us to think via John Rawls about empathetic societal planning based on the role of dice in deciding who does which job. And it began to help us think about the haves and have-nots in agricultural practice. So last week was about husbandry and community and industrial, pre-industrial, and even post-industrial worlds. This week, one of the things that our readings have really provoked us to think about is the way that we conceptualize nature. And it's a huge topic. There are many, many courses to focus on in this. But a central theme in food studies, as Kathy Rudy shares with us, is something like the following. How much do humans need to conform to nature versus how much humans are designed to manipulate nature for their own use? And that seems like an easy question in a way, but in a way it's not at all. It's quite complex. This came up, of course, last week, and I think it's going to come up a lot today. And Wendell Berry's main argument is that humans need to conform to nature more fully. And first, in terms of today's thinking, let's continue to keep in mind this question of the dichotomy of humanity versus nature. It's a theological problem, it's a legal problem, it's a biological problem. There's any number of ways that we have folks in this room who have written in leading ways about that. And there's a wonderful environmental philosopher named David Abrams who thinks about this in the following way. This human mind is not some otherworldly essence that comes to house itself inside our physiology. Rather, it is instilled and provoked by the sensorial field itself, induced by the tensions and participations between the human body and the animate earth. Altogether, these make up a particular state of mind, a place-specific intelligence shared by the humans that dwell there, but also by the coyotes, by the bobcats, the ferns, and the spiders, by all beings who live and make their way in that zone. Each place in place-specific intelligence has its own psyche. Very interesting. And Abrams really comes from a tradition of Merleau-Ponty and other philosophers who really want to think about a mind-body-world continuum. And it's very interesting that philosophers keep coming up in our conversation about the pragmatics of food. Second, I think we need to think today about questions about our national tradition of environmental ethics as an opportunity to have us turn to nature as a source. And it's led to things like our setting aside land in national parks. And it makes us rethink in our readings today the questions that the transcendentalists grappled with. Can we, as they did, try to find the goodness in both humanity and nature, not as a dichotomy, but something interrelated? Thoreau especially saw farming as a problem, taking people away from contemplation on what is good and important to be learned from nature. Walden is about moving away from that, but the bean field of Thoreau is an attempt to recreate an agriculture that's in connection with place and solitude. So it's a very interesting question, the role of the transcendentalists in this larger conversation about humanity and nature. And finally, Berry also begins to put the farmer at the center of the human-nature relationship. And he argues that science continues to be disconnected from that, and he wants to push us to end that separation. There's a lot to criticize there, and I hope we do continue to think about that with Berry. Are there two things that need to be wed, or is it better to think of a single entity with interlocking pieces? And if we do that, then what counts as nature and what counts as human, or perhaps everything counts? And if that's the case, then we have an entirely different philosophical problem on our hands. And so finally, I want to just broaden the scope in terms of the university course. Today, we're looking at this relationship between humans and natures and how we've imagined it in America, and also how to reconfigure it. And we're doing so with expert legal thinkers who also clearly in their lives and in their writing have a deep commitment to this reconfiguration. And that commitment is bound up with an ethics and a philosophy. In other words, neither of our speakers today is a purely legal or legalistic thinker, but rather deeply inspired by an ethics and philosophy. And that's the kind of holistic perspective that we really want to encourage in this class. And this is an opportunity today to think about the way that law and legal thinking is relevant to every single one of you in this class. Law is humanistic thinking translated into a pragmatism, of course, and I'd like to invite the engineers and the biologists in this room to think about the boundaries of your science, the ethical boundaries of your science. You will need lawyers to help with that every minute of your professional lives. And the social scientists or business folks in this room thinking about the ethical regulation of your social and contractual practices. So in all of these ways, we need legal thinking. Each field in a university has its own individual genius, and here is an example of how law today can bind us together. So welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Laurie. I realize this podium may appear to interpose a barrier between me and you, but it also puts the notes that I've prepared on a nearer line between my eyes and your eyes, which I think is helpful. I prepared to talk for about 45 minutes. Is that still right? Yes. Okay, good, good. So I'm going to talk about how land and food and agriculture have been seen in American thinking about nature and the human place in nature. I've given you some passages to read. I understand some of them are dense, and I'm going to stay as close as I can to these, though I'll also go off to make larger points. And I'll take them more or less chronologically. So first, consider William Bradford, who was the governor of the Plymouth colony. That's the Pilgrims, the Thanksgiving people, describing the new continent that he and his people had reached. He called it a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men. Wilderness, he said. Today we think of wilderness as something special, something to preserve, a place where nature is unspoiled. For Bradford, the wilderness he saw in the New World was ugly, literally, visually, and metaphorically. It was physically dangerous and also spiritually dangerous. It was a place the Pilgrims had to pass through, hoping to reach a better place, like the biblical Israelites in the desert that they identified with, that he compares them to in the last paragraph of the excerpt I gave you. So something this passage highlights in the way that it captures William Bradford's way of seeing the Atlantic coast at the beginning of the 17th century is that nature is not just there. A landscape is something that people see. It's formed by the interaction of the bare facts, trees, stones, storms, wolves, and how people see those things, the vocabulary and images and stories that they have for making sense of them. When I write about this, I call it environmental imagination, our way of envisioning the world, how it works, why it matters, where we fit in it. This lecture is not mainly a history of ideas in the sense of intellectual history as much as it is a history of environmental imagination. The people we read for today all contributed to or exemplify episodes of this history. They help us to see how we came to where we are. So let's go back to Bradford and the early settlers around him first. For them, the continent had two kinds of value, two ways you could say that they could see it. It had spiritual importance on the one hand, and for them that drew on biblical images and stories. It was a testing ground for their faith and virtue. The image that many of them had of the word wilderness was desert, like the one where the Israelites wandered or where Jesus was tempted by Satan. And the other kind of value they could see, which was very different, was commodity importance, when parts of the new continent could be made useful or sold. From the very beginning, descriptions of North America included elaborate calculations of the value of furs, timbers, metals. It was an investment target as much as anything else. So after William Bradford wrote, and especially after American independence, settling the continent to make it useful and productive became a national mission. Lawyers and philosophers declared that making the wilderness economically productive was a human duty. So when European settlers took land from Native Americans, those were Bradford's wild men, remember wild men in the new continent, they were not invading. They were carrying out their responsibility. It was more like a humanitarian intervention in a way, enforcing natural law against Native Americans who were failing to fulfill the human duty to use the continent. And the national mission was to clear the land and settle it. For decades after independence, presidents and judges and other national leaders always put two words together, wilderness and the verb reclaim. The country had to reclaim the wilderness, that is, had to bring it under human command and make it productive. And this was a moral mission as well as a practical one in the way that it was talked about, to find a kind of national identity and purpose. So I gave you a little from Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a revolutionary leader and the third president, who gave a classic statement of what settling the continent would mean. It would produce a continent of small farmers, and small farmers, in Jefferson's view, were the finest people in the world. They were good most of all because they were independent. They didn't need to cultivate anyone else's goodwill. Merchants depended on customers and markets. Craftsmen and lawyers depended on clients. Artists and intellectuals depended on patrons. Slaves depended on their masters, and masters depended on their slaves. And although Jefferson's own history in this matter was complicated and disappointing, intellectually he thought this was one of the worst things about a slave economy. But farmers, as Jefferson saw them, depended only on their own labor and the weather. You could rely on them to use their own judgment, not the judgment of someone else they were dependent on, and think freely and with open minds about any public question, and that made them ideal citizens. So this picture was at the heart of American ideas about land for the better part of a century. An open continent of free land, made free by pressing the indigenous inhabitants westward, made it possible to create a nation of free people, free settlers, as long as they kept pushing forward and making it productive. So let's jump forward now about half a century to the first half of the 19th century, as the country grows richer and more powerful and spreads west. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are two very important sources of American thinking about nature, and especially the strands of thinking that later became what we call environmentalism. And they both thought that the national goal of settling the continent, becoming rich and free, was not enough. The material we have here is from the 1830s and 1840s. Emerson was the older man and the more famous, and he saw himself as trying to convince Americans to turn themselves from a parochial republic into a great culture. He thought his neighbors, Americans, were conformists, insecure, always looking over their shoulders to see what someone else thought or what the trends were in London and Paris. He wrote, "Man is the dwarf of himself." He meant the people as they actually were a diminished caricature of what they should be. His answer was that they needed to stop looking outside to neighbors or to Europe and find greatness in themselves. And that meant trusting themselves. They had to shake off their conformist habits, and this presented a philosophical problem, a problem of knowledge. To trust themselves, they had to know themselves. And one way to do that, Emerson said, was to look at nature. That was because both nature and human beings were projections into the world of the mind of God, the meaning of the universe. Nature, in Emerson's phrase, was the expositor of the divine mind, and that mind was also our true self. Now, it's pretty difficult to see exactly what it would mean to follow out this idea in practice. But I think a key thing to take away from it is a thought that has never really gone away in the American environmental imagination, that encounters with nature can make us clearer on who we are, that they can inspire us to reconnect with better and higher selves, selves that see further and don't just go through life by habit. It's an idea that we see again spelled out in John Muir a little later. Now notice what happens to farmers in Emerson. They were the heart of one kind of American greatness and mission, which we saw in Jefferson. But Emerson, right after telling us that we should learn to see a landscape as the face of God, and so, in a way, a person's true ideal face, goes on to say, you cannot freely admire a noble field if laborers are digging in the field hard by. The poet, continuing to quote Emerson, finds something ridiculous in his delight until he's out of the sight of men, in this case, laboring men, farmers in particular. Now, it's not clear in this passage that the problem is with the laborers. Emerson's not saying that they're ugly, but that they make him shy. There he is, dreaming about divinity and his true self, and these men with calluses on their hands look up and say, who's that guy? What's he doing? And the poet isn't sure he has an answer that they can hear. But they do, no matter whose problem it is, get in the way of his reverie. And so Emerson says, farmers show us what discord is between man and nature. The progress across the continent that was supposed to make everything right in Jefferson is now making everything wrong. Instead of making nature perfect, it's alienating us from nature. So let's talk about Thoreau, who learned a lot from Emerson about how to see things. Thoreau's Walden is almost a cliché in a syllabus. It's a touchstone for environmental thinking, even though it was somewhere else that Thoreau wrote, in wildness is the preservation of the world, which is worth pausing over because it's a monumental phrase. It completely reverses the Pilgrim Governor William Bradford's idea that wilderness was what we had to overcome and reclaim. And instead, wildness is, in Thoreau's phrase, the necessary thing for life. Now, Thoreau opens the book by explaining why he went to the woods. He says it was an experiment to try to learn how to be free. As he saw it, most of his neighbors in Concord, Massachusetts, weren't free at all. They were chained to jobs, property, their neighbors' opinions, and above all, they weren't free in their own minds. They could imagine only one way to live, which was the way they had been raised and knew. And their own narrow-mindedness, Thoreau said, insistently enslaved them like a southern slave's chains. It wasn't a casual or insensitive comparison. Thoreau hated actual slavery with a passion, but he thought there were degrees of enslavement and degrees of freedom, and that mental freedom was the highest form. And farmers, for Thoreau, Laurie alluded to this, were the worst of all. They were model Americans, and for Thoreau, that meant they were perfectly self-enslaved, laboring and saving and working until they died. They were doing penance, he said, without ever having sinned. They were tied to the land like serfs by their own choices. He gives an image of immortal souls pushing barns inch by inch down the road and eating the dirt that they're working on as if it were the only thing that would keep them alive. But Thoreau, at Walden, where he conducted his experiment in thinking clearly to be free, did farm in a manner of speaking. He grew a bean field there. And we've lost that description because of the photocopying mistake, which I only came across over the weekend, so I apologize to you. There was a part of a chapter that was meant to be in the reading that isn't. You have only the first 2 pages of the chapter called The Bean Field. So I'll tell you, he concluded there that he didn't think highly, after a year of harvesting beans, of labor to grow things to sell or even to use. And he ended the chapter by saying that next year he would leave all the beans to the wild animals and not harvest any. But he did value labor on the land as a meditative exercise. It was a way of remembering that the universe was much bigger and older than the moment in which you were acting and the work you were doing. So he hoed beans while he listened to the militia drilling in the village, and he thought that their shots sounded like toy guns, far away and not very powerful. And as he worked, he thought about the futility and the violence of the Mexican-American War and felt distant from it. He worked to shake off the habits and distractions of the village and to try to know his own mind. Work as a kind of meditative practice. So let's talk a little about food in Thoreau. What Thoreau says about food and eating is very strange and intense, and it captures, I think, his divided mind about nature and the place of people in it. So he wanted to enter deeply into the world. That was his whole project, in a way. But he also wanted to rise above it and leave it behind. He saw going into nature, living by nature, as a path to insight, but also at the same time a kind of corruption. He saw the world as somewhat fallen, rather like William Bradford had, even though there was a great distance between Thoreau and Bradford. So he writes about eating meat in a way that a modern vegetarian would recognize. He says there's something unclean about meat, the way it decays and stinks, that he saw because he was doing his own cooking and cleaning his own kitchen. And because he was trying to think through whatever he did, he contemplated the muscle and fat that he was eating, and he found that, as he put it, the imagination will not be reconciled to it. And he urged that the imagination and the body should be able to sit down together at the same table. That is, we should be able to contemplate without discomfort the thing that we're eating and not set aside our thinking and moral mind to give the body a quick charge of flavor and calories. But it turns out that in Thoreau, this thought is connected to a much greater asceticism. It's a mistrust of pleasure and of the body, and in a way of nature. He writes, nature, this is Thoreau, nature is hard to be overcome, but she must be overcome. This nature that he's referring to is the appetite for meat, but it's also sexual appetite. It's the appetite for pleasure. He urges chastity, and he says that the man who refuses sex, like the vegetarian, goes from dissipation to knowing that, this is Thoreau again, the animal is dying out in him day by day, which is a good thing, and the divine is being established. So it's not accidental that Thoreau's nature is a she, and what he rejects in this feminine, sensual, natural impulse, as he portrays it, is quite sweeping. He says, all sensuality is one. All sensuality is one, though it takes many forms. All purity is one. It's the same whether a man eat or drink or cohabit or sleep sensually. Each of these things is what Thoreau calls an animal in us, reptile and sensual, a kind of indwelling sin. So this, to us, weird, self-disgusted Thoreau is very far from the friendly hippie that he sometimes seems to be. The nature that he writes about is a redemption from the mental slavery of the towns and jobs and society, but it's also full of sin. It's full of aversion of the same ugly wilderness that William Bradford disliked so much. But Thoreau, a last note on Thoreau, he sounds very different toward the end of the book in another passage I gave you, with a lovely return to the idea that people are beautiful, in part because we're continuous with a beautiful nature. He says that we're living poetry, like the leaves of a tree, part of something that, his phrase again, is not a fossil earth, but a living earth. And he looks at a dirt bank melting and beginning to flow in the spring. This is one of the most sensual and difficult passages in Walden. And he thinks of bowels, and he thinks of childbirth. And he isn't disgusted this time, but he celebrates them. And then he praises the vulture, the carrion-eating vulture, for taking its life from the transience of life. And instead of sensual appetites making him think of sin and death, he finds that death makes him think of life, of what he calls the inviolable health of nature, which continues through individual lives and deaths. And then he says that we need, though he doesn't insist on the word here, wildness, to keep us vital and alert. He says we need to witness our own limits transgressed. Witness our own limits transgressed, and find some life pasturing where we never wander, some part of the world that's beyond our control, beyond our, in a way, our concern. So that is where we find John Muir. John Muir is a different character from Thoreau and Emerson in the sense that he did a great deal to create a social movement that was a crucible of environmental politics and lawmaking at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And that was the Sierra Club, which was a movement and also a community and also a kind of practice. So in reading Muir, we're getting at all of these things and not just at the mind of an individual. Muir's writings, including the excerpt that I gave you, are a kind of field guide to epiphany. They're part detail of the trail that you should hike when you go to the Sierra Nevada, of what it'll look like when you come around the corner of Half Dome and Yosemite. And it's partly these soaring descriptions of how you'll feel when you get there. And a whole subculture that developed in the 1890s and forward took these hikes and described them to one another in this language and created a political movement to preserve landscapes where they could have this experience. You could say that they turned environmental imagination into political action. And let's think about the nature that John Muir describes and that movement of Muir-inspired people went out looking for. Because in one way, nature here and wilderness are all good. They have spiritual qualities. Muir says that stone in the high Sierra, granite, is clothed with living light. This is typical prose from Muir. All spiritualized, steadfast and serene strength like a god. He says that when you're up there in the high country, there's no pain, quoting again, no dull, empty hours, no fear of the past, no fear of the future. And he says that in this landscape, this dramatic, extreme, inspiring landscape, the whole body seems to feel beauty equally through all one's flesh like radiant heat. So this is where we first get, I think, fully expressed an American idiom of nature that we recognize instantly if we just take away some of the poetic flourishes. It's what makes it possible to say, I went into the mountains for a week, and I really just felt like myself again. I went up into Yosemite, and I felt like I saw God. It's why it was possible in the 1960s when the Senate was debating the Wilderness Act, which I'll talk about a little later, for Senator Frank Church, who was a Democrat from Montana, back when there were Democrats from Montana, said, without wilderness, this country would become a cage, which is an amazing thought. If it were impossible to go out into the kind of untamed spaces that Muir and the Sierra Club valued and wanted to preserve, that in some way you couldn't get free anywhere. For a senator to be able to say that, without wilderness, the country would become a cage, says something about the prevalence of the ideas that John Muir is setting out here. And Muir, in some ways, is continuing the idea from Emerson and Thoreau that if you encounter nature in the right way, it'll help you to get clear on who you are. But he's also making it much less abstract, much less New England, much less philosophical, and much more a guide to experience. As I said before, this is where you will go. These are the trails. Here are some friends who will go with you. And when you see it, this is how you might feel, and you can tell one another about it. It makes it a much more practical thing, and by becoming a practical thing that people could build communities around, it also became the basis for political movements that are still with us and for changing laws to make parks and ultimately wilderness areas where people could pursue these experiences. So let's notice a few more things about what Muir is describing. So the first thing, at its least poetic, what Muir is telling us about is a vacation. We go to the high country, to use Thoreau's phrase, to witness our own limits transgressed. But then we go back to the lowlands. You definitely can't stay in the Sierra high country all year, and they didn't. And down there, we're back, I guess, with fear of the past and fear of the future and boredom, all of the things he says are not in the high country. The second thing related to this, wilderness and nature, in the way that Muir describes them, are wholly good. But the world is not wholly good. The world was divided in a way for Thoreau spiritually between the sense that nature was sacred and the sense that it was fallen at the same time. Muir, I would say, divided it geographically. He divided nature into the high country, which was sacred in a kind of secular church or natural cathedral, and the lowlands, which were fallen and where you couldn't really hope for much of anything. And farming, laboring and especially farming, belonged to the lowlands for Muir. So there's a shepherd in Yosemite Valley who he writes a little about. And the shepherd is a comic character who doesn't appreciate the beauty around him. Other men, Muir's kind of men, get religion in the mountains. And women, too. There was actually a lot of prominent leadership as well as participation in the Sierra Club by women of the progressive era. But the shepherd just gets dirty. He's like Emerson's laborers who interrupt the poet in his reflection. So a last point. In this new ideal of nature, the high country, the wilderness, is a place where there is really nothing to eat, and certainly no food is produced there. That's all reserved to the fallen part of the world, the lowlands. Muir himself had nothing to say about food anywhere that I've been able to find, except that he wandered the high Sierra with a loaf of bread and claimed that he didn't need any more. And he often gave the impression that he lived on sunlight and air. And Thoreau gets grief for letting his mother do his laundry, which I think is a little unfair, though I understand the impulse, because he's so self-righteous and people sort of want to get him. But consider this. So Muir, who spent his youth on amazing walking treks, and his older years as a celebrated writer and nature advocate, he was first president of the Sierra Club and was president for about 15 years, had a midlife career, which he doesn't write about, as a produce farmer. He raised fruit and vegetables for the San Francisco groceries, and he was known, I gather, for being the first guy in line to get his crates on the train into the city first thing in the morning on market days. So he was exactly the guy that Emerson and Thoreau criticized, the laboring, hyper-responsible farmer. And as I said, as far as I know, he never wrote about this part of his life. It didn't have a place in his picture, the John Muir Sierra Club picture of what was valuable in nature or what was a good way to connect with the living world. So his own life took place on both sides of his divide between a sacred wilderness and a fallen world of lowland work. But he didn't find a way to talk about them together, which I think is revealing about the way that he understood nature and what was valuable in it. I usually teach in rooms with clocks somewhere. Does someone have an update on what does that mean for me? Perfect, thanks. So Aldo Leopold, the next person whose material I gave you, is a very different character. But he has in common with Muir that he was a movement person, part of a very important and consequential movement in environmental politics. So I've given you a couple of his essays on farming and conservation and ecology. But the first thing to know about Leopold is that he was one of the most important and successful wilderness advocates in the 20th century. He was a founder and a very essential thinker in the Wilderness Society, which was really the crucible of wilderness politics for decades. They were largely behind the legislation that I described the senator from Montana as praising a little earlier. And under that legislation, which was passed in 1964, there are now more than 107 million acres of federal public land in the U.S. that are preserved as wilderness, which means they can never be developed and they can't be exploited for anything more intensive than backpacking and camping. There's a pretty amazing dedication of acreage to the ideal that Muir and the Wilderness Society set out. So the wilderness advocates, whom Leopold was very much part of, in a way radicalized John Muir's program. Muir and the early Sierra Club were advocates for national parks, and those included roads and lodges and concert halls. Muir talked about how one park was great because you could take the train from San Francisco and walk off the platform in the park, and a few minutes later you'd be in isolation. But, not really in isolation, or not an isolation that's going to last very long. And the Wilderness Society people pushed back against all of that. They were basically much harder core about wilderness. They wanted land you had to walk into, which took a while to walk across, and which was inconvenient and hard. And Leopold was one of their chief theorists. He probably did more than anyone else to explain why wilderness was worth preserving and to provide the arguments that helped convince other people that it was true. But these passages from the work that he's best known for are about ecology and farming. He set this ideal, a food chain, this is quoting Leopold, aimed to harmonize the wild and the tame. He contrasted that ideal with what he called clean farming, which was the kind that drove out the wild elements and turned everything to economic profit. So clean farming, as Leopold described it, was a kind of warfare against the fertility and diversity of the natural world. And looking at clean farming, conventional farming, with ecological understanding meant what Leopold called living alone in a world of wounds, alone because other people couldn't see the harm. He called the traces of this kind of farming the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and doesn't want to be told otherwise. So the basis of Leopold's criticism of clean farming and his praise of what you might call integrated farming or just dirty farming was the same. It was the perspective of ecology, which is now very, very familiar to us, of course, almost second nature, but deserves to be remarked on in a historical sketch like this because it's really an innovation in public understanding and imagination between John Muir's time at the end of the 19th century and the time that Aldo Leopold is doing his writing, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And Leopold is really very early in it. So this is a new view about how nature works, that everything is connected in complex and elusive ways, and also interpermeable, which has a few consequences, which are familiar to us, but were new then. First, the negative and scary consequence, that poison that's released, say, into the air will travel through different systems. It'll travel through winds and soil and waterways. It'll end up in food and tissues and bloodstreams. But also more positively, there's kind of a new aesthetic, a new way of seeing things as beautiful that comes with the idea of nature as complicatedly interdependent. That any ecosystem that works well was likely to be a thing of great complexity and subtlety and beautiful to understand. And it had the consequence that any practice such as industrial farming that simplified natural systems by subtracting elements or inserting industrial substitutes ran the risk of doing unexpected but drastic damage. And even when it succeeded, even when an industrial substitute for natural processes succeeded, it would do that at a cost to the beauty of the system, which came from a complexity that produced and sustained many forms of life and made space both for those that people use and for the ones that people don't use. So Leopold hoped that understanding this complexity and valuing it as something beautiful would be two parts of the same learning process, and that farming would be a place where the wild qualities that he was so committed to preserving in nature and the human qualities of work, order, regularity, and need would be able to meet and achieve a kind of practical harmony. And I think that ideal in Aldo Leopold is in some ways the opening point for thinking about the work of Wendell Berry. And I would say that what happens in a way between Leopold writing at the end of the 1940s, he died in 1948, I think, and Berry writing in 1977 in The Unsettling of America, is that another new idea comes into the center of American thinking and conversation, which seems utterly familiar to us and was a very important novelty. So this is the idea of the environment. The idea that a whole set of problems and issues, land policy, whether to have parks or not parks, timbering, litter, water pollution, that these are all part of an area of issues called environmental, and that they all have to do with something called the environment. This is, again, second nature to us. But it's a perception about how the world is organized that gets developed, I think, most prominently in the 1960s and becomes a centerpiece of, as I said, of imagination. So, second, the idea that there is an environmental crisis, that there's a deep and dangerous problem in our way of relating to the natural world, which is expressed in all or many of the issues that are gathered together under the label environmental. And third, the idea develops around this that the environmental crisis reveals something deep about our civilization, that something is off-kilter or misplaced in the way that we live on the world and the way that we think about our place in the world. So this set of perceptions in the 60s and 70s, I think in some ways particularly in the early and mid-1970s, inspired people to try to rethink many areas of life and tradition in line with, well, let's say, in the ambition to try to understand a new set of environmental problems. People did this in philosophy and ethics. They did it in economics. They did it in relation to technology. They did it in relation to religion. And what Wendell Berry tried to do was to rethink farming ecologically in relation to the new sense of environmental crisis, and to try to rethink culture and ecology as well in a way that puts farming at the center of the whole problem. So the reason I want to spend a little time on Berry, and I realize that you talked about him last week as well with Norman Wurzbach, is that I think he describes important parts of what have come to seem valuable to us in food and farming in the last decade, and that this development that we're living through and participating in marks another change in environmental imagination and a potential change in environmental politics and law, which we should be trying to think through even as we're participating in it. So let me give you some of the key ideas from the Berry passages. So he says on page 43, food is a cultural product. It can't be produced by technology alone. That is, growing food, consuming food, comes from a way of working and a way of valuing work, and a way of eating, and a way of valuing eating. He says, on the topic of culture, a healthy culture is a communal order of memory, insight, value, work, conviviality, reverence, aspiration. It's a lot of terms, and he just throws in the word healthy. Berry likes to use strong normative words like that in a fairly unproblematic way, which, if you want, we can talk about later. But let's just take the thought that the way we get our food and what we do with it can't be separated from what we think is valuable in how we live together, what we think about work, what we think about community, how we think of the past, and how we are together. And he says a culture, whether the kind he recommends and calls healthy or a different kind of culture, is also a tradition. He says such an attitude, the attitude he wants, comes from a passion that is culturally prepared, a passion for excellence and order that is handed down to young people by older people whom they respect and love. So tradition, the word tradition, literally means what is passed from hand to hand, handed down. The Latin is tradere, it's like trade, things exchanged hand to hand. So Barry uses words very deliberately, and when he talks about what is handed down culturally, you know that he means tradition. He means what we hand on from one generation to the next. But he wants to make it more concrete and tell you just what it is in words that have things attached to them, like the hands that hand off a sense of what it is to do work. So that's the idea that he's working to make concrete in the first part of this poem, Work Song, where he's describing the memory of farmers who are no longer alive, who, he says, in their short lives and the brevity of their strength claim an ancient joy. And when he describes this farmer shouting, "Make me know it, hand it to me, boy," I imagine throwing a bale of hay so hard that it almost knocks someone off the wagon where you're stacking the hay, just because you can, just to show that you can in the years that you're alive. I think of it that way because that's the kind of farming that I grew up in. But what's being handed over really is work and life in a place. So he describes farming as basically ecological, to return to his major themes, and says that because of the complexity of the world, we have to act with complexity in our minds in order to produce simplicity. Let me try to explain this paradox a little further. The thought is that simple thinking will only produce complex catastrophes because it will obscure from us so much of the consequences of what we do. Think of fertilizer runoff, think of pesticide runoff, think of soil gradually leached away by erosion when you don't have winter cover crops, just to take a few examples. Things out of sight, out of mind, but which come back and produce complicated catastrophes because you have simplified the way that you're working. So he says, and here again he wants to connect the moral and the cultural with the agricultural and ecological. And you can ask yourselves whether you agree with all parts or just some parts. But he says, and it's a very powerful pair of statements. First, we can simplify our minds and our culture only at the cost of an oppressive social and mechanical complexity. We can simplify our society, that is, make ourselves free, only by undertaking tasks of great mental and cultural complexity. Farming is a task that calls for this sort of complexity, both in the character of the farmer and in his culture. To simplify either one, either the culture, the practice of agriculture, or the character of the farmer, the range of knowledge and the kind of judgment this person has to have, is to destroy it. And then he says that it's not enough for farming to be done right, that farming has to be done within an interlocking set of systems, economic, political, cultural, that are also done right. The definitive relationships in the universe, he says, are not competitive but interdependent. We can build one system only within another. We can have agriculture only within nature and culture only within agriculture. At certain critical points, these systems have to conform with one another or destroy one another. He also says, and here is a central idea for him, that what we don't understand, we're unlikely to do well or to take care of. And so an economy that stretches great distances and through complex supply chains and through all kinds of environmental externalities, though I don't think that's a phrase that appears anywhere in Wendell Berry's writing, is all but certain to be a moral catastrophe. He says, and this is central to his thinking, this phrase from 83 to 84, the great difficulty with being people, basically, is that we are trustworthy only so far as we can see. The length of our vision is our moral boundary. This is the heart of the idea that we have to try to make things, to do our work in ways that are complicated enough in the way that they take account of the natural systems that we're interacting with, that we are able actively to keep track of all the sources and all the consequences of our work. Because the simplified form of food production that we've created, he says, has obscured most of the resource use and most of the work that goes into producing what we eat. Put it out of sight, put it out of our practical sense of moral responsibility, and made it a kind of catastrophe in consequence. And this brings him to one last great theme of his work, that work itself is not something to be escaped, but something to be embraced when it achieves a certain quality of knowledge and responsibility. And that work of that kind is not just a matter of prudence. It's not just a way of acknowledging limits and achieving a desirable complexity in our ecological relations. It's also a way of participating in them, of being part of them. He says there's work that is restorative, convivial, dignified, and pleasing. Good work, he says, is the enactment of connections. That is the form of participating in an ecologically complex world in a way that is as fully possible cognizant, aware of the full scope of that complexity, and that works in it not only with the benefit of that knowledge, but also in a way that is, as far as possible, consistent with the continuation, the survival of that world in a kind of robust health. And work of that kind, he says, defines us as we are. This is on 140. Not too good to work with our bodies, but too good to work poorly or joylessly or selfishly or alone. And so in this writing, farming and eating become the most practical and the most moral expressions of our basic metabolism with the earth, an effort to take responsibility for, to understand and to restrain our effects on the rest of the living world, and to acknowledge our community with other species and with past and future generations. It becomes the work, to take another line from that poem, Work Song, whose hardship is its possibility. That's Barry. So a few last observations about what we might make of this. And what I'm trying to do is use Wendell Berry to reconstruct, if I can, some of the philosophical and some of the practical perspectives on the significance of agriculture as an example, a practical example of a new ecological, humanized yet not anti-natural way of understanding our place within the natural world. A few observations about this. One, it's a way of looking at America. The farming that he's describing is not the farming of people conquering and settling a continent. It's the farming of a people who've come to the end of the continent and turned around to face one another and to look at the land that they wrecked along the way. It's also a way of looking at nature. It finds meaning in nature not in its most dramatic and extreme places, but in the most ordinary ones. And it tries to connect the transcendent and the everyday in the same way that Leopold urged farmers to harmonize the wild and the tame. And from this point of view, Muir's wilderness, which was for him an elevated and clarifying place apart like a cathedral, a sacred separate space, is everywhere if we just approach it right. So Thoreau said that we need to have our limits transgressed by wildness. But the ecological perspective teaches, according to Berry, that our limits are so porous that they're always being transgressed, and that we should open our minds to that. And in this view, finally, what Bradford saw as moral wilderness, remember the howling, desolate, disordered world on the new continent, is not in the wild. It's instead in the world that we made. It's in the industrial food system that we created, but that we only halfway understand, and whose consequences we don't perfectly control. Right. That was most of what I wanted to say about that. So I hope it gives us a starting place for Michelle to say some things that I think will bring us sort of back to the ground. And then we can all talk. No.
No, I've got it. So Judd's a little taller than I, so I'm going to take a moment and try to move this. Thank you very much. Because otherwise I would not be able to see over it to see all of you. So Judd's been talking a lot about the philosophical underpinnings of modern environmental theory and actually the history of the environmental movement in this country. And I want to bring it to the political and dealing with land and dealing with the environment and ultimately dealing with our food system. So we have a body of laws governing the environment, governing activities around industrial production, manufacturing activity, around food production and the like, that reflect a lot of the underpinnings of this philosophical thinking, this the movements that Jed has described. And if you look back over at the history of the country from when it was first founded and started, society came together to start governing itself and governing the activities of the land, you see this disconnect that at the very outset we viewed this land, this very well-wooded land, to use a phrase from a writer whose works I really like, and looking at a way of harnessing the various environmental resources, natural resources, and energy that the land offered as a way of conquering it and promoting the development of our culture and our economy. So if you look at laws governing oil and gas development and extraction, mining, and even water usage, you see an odd treatment in that the land, the surface of the land that we occupy, where we reside, that we walk across, that we drive our horses across, is separated from what underlies it, so that you can sever the actual estate that you own in the land. And this is a really weird concept, to think that land can be divided like a pack of cards that has really, a relationship certainly to each other, but no consequence of that division, that you can shuffle things up at will and not have to suffer consequences from that reshuffling. Forests were also treated very much in that way. Something, it was viewed as an agricultural product, the timber on those lands. Everyone wanted a woodlot so that you would have a cash crop in times of need. And there wasn't that same concept of husbandry or replanting, and there wasn't the idea that the forests were actually connected with a lot of the animals that people enjoyed hunting, that they needed for their sustenance, that it was connected with the birds that made the springtime so pleasant, or connected with the quality of the waters that they relied on for drinking or for irrigating their lands. We have a modern Forest Act that comes closer to reconciling those different features in terms of looking at it as multiple use, providing multiple uses and trying to develop a management plan that safeguards and promotes those different uses. But that wasn't the way things started at the beginning. When you look at the development of modern environmental law from the 60s and 70s that Jed alluded to, you still have this disconnect and this idea that we are conquering the environment. Recognition certainly that there are consequences, but those are consequences that can be regulated, and they can be compartmentalized in a way that denies the integration of the entire ecology, that treats water separately from land, that treats land separately from the air, that treats the air separately from waste products and the byproducts of manufacturing. So you have the development of modern statutes such as the Clean Water Act that has a legal fiction in terms of the actual water cycle, treating surface water distinctly from the wetlands and tributaries and ephemeral streams that feed those navigable waters that the Clean Water Act addresses, and completely disregards groundwater. The Clean Water Act doesn't talk about groundwater at all, and that is left as a feat of regulation for the states. You have the Clean Air Act without any kind of connection between the fact that what goes up into the air actually comes down upon the water and the land and has an impact. If you look at the way coal-fired power plants, for example, are regulated, it's all about controlling those emissions for the nearby communities. And in the very technological solutions that have been crafted to enable manufacturing facilities to meet those very strict air quality requirements, you have the development of other waste products, the concentration of waste products that then have no means of regulation within the context of that body of law. You have to go to another body of law, to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and look at how you're supposed to be disposing of this part. And our regulatory structures, then, our government has responded in a way that mimics that separation and that balkanization, that disconnect between the different ecological functions. And I think that it's that disconnect that really creates a lot of the environmental problems that we see today. The way the environmental laws have developed are also very complex, and they become technical barriers to participation, to the type of exercise of democratic ideals that Judd talked about with Thomas Jefferson and his view of what the United States was and would become. These become barriers to participation because most people don't, they're not engineers. They don't understand dispersion modeling. They don't understand hydrogeologic consequences. They don't understand the chemical interactions between waste products and the water or the soil or the rocks that the waste products are being disposed into. And so when you go to these public hearings, yes, there are public hearings that are designed to further public participation, get the sentiment, feel the pulse, if you will, of the community. But when you talk with the hearing officers, what they say is, we're not here to listen to you and what you want for your community. What we're here to do is figure out whether there are technical defects within the context of the permit that we propose to issue. And if you can't address that, then your viewpoint is really disregarded within that governmental structure. And in fact, the only modern environmental law that really recognizes this holistic view is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires a comprehensive analysis of all the different impacts to different media from any particular federal action, and requires that that be analyzed in a synergistic way, to be looking at cumulative impacts, to look at connected actions. The problem with that is that once you get that information that is produced through the National Environmental Policy Act, there's no mandate over how you then respond. It doesn't say that if these impacts are going to be unattractive or perhaps result in human health impacts or the decimation of a species, that you can't go forward. It's simply procedural. The reason it's procedural is that the drafters of that law thought that if you just informed the public and invited their participation, then the government would respond in kind and lead to good decision making. And unfortunately, that reality has not always borne out in the way that this process works. Companies and governments alike view that environmental review process as very messy, very cumbersome, somewhat vague, without clear answers for what they're supposed to do with the information. And so, as a consequence, they take shortcuts, they try to hamper public involvement in the process, and try to find ways to short-circuit and avoid having to do this type of complete environmental analysis. We see similar disconnects with the legal systems and regulatory systems that have evolved to manage our food and agricultural production cycles as well. And I think that those also reflect an intent or a desire to conquer nature and to make the processes themselves very efficient, economically robust for those who would profit from the exercise. It's very capital intensive, our modern industrial agricultural system. And that certainly presents barriers to entry for new farmers, for young farmers, for people who are not landed. But it also results in a concentration of wealth and a concentration in land and of land ownership and a concentration in political influence that I would think that Governor Bradford would be horrified to witness today. These were the very types of systems, this concentration of wealth and power, that those who settled this land initially sought to avoid. They wanted to get rid of that, evade that tyranny from Europe and come over here and start a new land and a new democracy. But with the way that our laws have evolved around agriculture, around environmental issues, it reinforces and leads us, I think, back down that path of the very systems that those early settlers wanted to avoid to begin with. So we have regulations that govern runoff, that govern inputs such as pesticides and other toxic chemicals to our food system or our agricultural production system. And we have exemptions in environmental laws that favor this agrarian myth of our forefathers and ignore the impact on the environment. As a result, it ends up legitimizing an unsustainable model. And I myself, unfortunately, feel like I participated in that a little bit when I was working on some of these regulations to develop waste management technologies. I wanted to deal with the problems that the communities were facing around large industrial livestock operations, and thinking that more technology would be the solution to this, because they're concentrating so many nutrients and so many toxins that you can't effectively spread it on the land that's available. You've got to find other ways of harnessing this and finding energy and making fertilizer and things out of it. And my honest idea, and I think those the ideas of the people who I was working with, was that that itself would become such an expense that it would create an opening for alternative models of production. But unfortunately, I think what it has resulted in is further legitimizing and finding technological fixes to what shouldn't be happening to begin with. If we look at the laws governing our food system, we see things, a surprising array of responses trying to address things like food safety, marketing claims, all designed towards a description of a uniform product, so that if you're in California or in Maine or in Florida or here in North Carolina, when you buy a jar of strawberry jam, you know what you're getting. It's not going to vary much in terms of texture, in terms of ingredients, in terms of appearance or taste, regardless of where you are in the country. Now, marketers want this, obviously, and food retailers want this because it helps them to streamline their own production systems. But I dare say that it's not necessarily an effective model and one that we want to replicate in terms of, what is healthy, what is sustainable, and what is culturally relevant in our food supply. So this loss of a sense of place that Barry talks about a lot in his writings that Jed had reproduced for you ties ties in connection with this migration of people from rural communities into the cities and fosters the disregard for the environment, the disregard of environmental consequences of agricultural production, and the disconnect to the point that we think that food comes from a store as opposed to from the soil. When I first moved to North Carolina, one of my biggest, things that I wanted to do was to have my own garden. And I had a little place where I could plant at my house, and then all of a sudden these plants started producing tomatoes and eggplants and okra, and I was afraid to eat them. I was afraid to eat the spinach or the lettuces that came out of my own garden because they were dirty. And I had seen slugs crawling on them, and I had seen other bugs, eating them. And I thought that my food was supposed to be clean and pretty. And I think that that's how a lot of people feel, that you have this real disconnect between, these are the packages of things that you find in the store, and this is the actual production process that goes into making them, and the different constraints that farmers face and have to contend with in getting that food into the nice, pretty packages for you. So in sum, I think that classes like this and the development of this local food movement that brings us all together here today shows a departure from the past and an envisioning of a more positive future. Neil Hamilton, who's a law professor at Drake University in Iowa, talks a lot about food democracy and the development of farmers markets and chefs who really want local food and the reconnection with regional cuisines and development of more of a cultural palette as an exercise of democracy. Michael Pollan talks about it in his books as voting with your fork. And we have lots of opportunities here in this area to be able to connect with those alternative production models with farms like Fickle Creek, which are similar to the polyface farms that is profiled in movies like Food Inc. and in Michael Pollan's books. And Joel Salatin has his own nice collection of writings if you are ever interested in good reads. My favorite is Everything I Want to Do is Illegal, talking about those very barriers that our regulatory system creates for alternative models and a return to a local food production system. So my hope is that in talking about these things, obviously this alone could be the topic of a separate discussion or a course. I hope you come away with some ideas about the ways in which laws influence consumer demand, influence production practices, influence the economics that make certain types of production possible. And as we think about that and revision what we want out of our communities and what we want out of our environment, that can lead to the exercise of real democracy and some political change governing the agricultural community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I forgot to explain to our guests that the way we're doing this, because of the recording system, I have to summarize the question that comes up, and then you need to answer it from up here. So I think that's the way we'll do it, and we have about 15 minutes before we go upstairs for our food. So questions, thoughts for our wonderful presenters today? Yes.
So, I'm sorry I'm terrible with names. But the speaker who just spoke.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Also, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to call you.
Indeed.
If you could do it over again, instead of making your regulations technology-based, how would you do it to sort of put us on a different route than we're on today?
Okay, so, sorry, I have to do this, but if you could do it over again, instead of your making your regulations technology-based, how would you create different regulations and on what basis?
There are a lot of different approaches that can be taken through the law to, is it okay if I talk?
Yeah,
here?
you're mic'd, so it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different approaches that can be taken through regulations in terms of setback preferences, so that you establish certain distances between the entity, in this case, say, a factory farm, and other important land uses that you want to protect, such as a water supply or a local creek or something. So you can approach things from that way. Zoning is another way of incorporating that aspect. But I think probably the biggest reform that I would, it's not too late, that I hope that we can address in our community is that of these externalities. That how do you get, our current cheap food system to reflect the real cost of the production itself? Obviously, we would need to deal with some of the unintended economic consequences of that, or where certain communities, low-income communities, would be adversely affected and more constrained than others. But if there's a way that we could get that system to internalize the costs of production and get the agricultural producers to really have to account for the waste that they produce and the health problems that they cause, I think that would do a much better job at leveling that playing field and creating more opportunities for alternative models of production.
Sorry, Lori had to step out and take a phone call. I'm going to sit in for her for a few minutes. Other questions? Yes.
So, to what extent do you think that, you talked about in the 18th, early 19th century, the idea of wilderness as something that should be reclaimed. To what extent do you think that that's a sort of philosophical argument, or to what extent do you think it was an economic reality? Because the only way you could improve your life was to take over new land and expand your community in new places.
So the question is, in turn of century, 1890, 1900, earlier, 1830, how much of the desire to reclaim wilderness was economic and how much was it philosophical?
Oh, good. So I think myself that the right way to see this sort of thing, if I can put it take the question at a sort of abstract level, on the relation between what you might call the material or the structural determinants of what we do and how we do it, and the intellectual or ideological determinants. So that you asked how much is it philosophical and how much is it economic or practical. I would say I see that development through the lens of a kind of two-step story, where first of all, it's pretty straightforward, I think, that given a continent of enormous riches in terms of what was valuable at the time, populated by people who were technologically vulnerable, that given the predilections and the capacities of European nations at that time, it was going to get taken, and there was going to be a story about how it was going to get taken. So in a certain way, you could say, well, the ideas are sort of window dressing. How I think that's not necessarily the whole story is that there could have been any number of justifications, and the particular justification that was most prominent in the Anglo-American scenario was the one that we talked about, that focused on the responsibility to make the natural world blossom, to make it productive, and on the kind of special status of the farmer or the productive resource user in a democracy. And both of those ideas, I think, have had independent and significant consequences on down the road. So I think there's a real kind of interaction between the two sorts of explanations, and that the balance and sequence is different for any of the chapters that we're talking about. I think it's a super helpful question because my lecture, given the heading, really concentrated on the development of ideas, but I think it's really important and valuable to understand these ideas within their kind of economic settings. So I appreciate it.
I'm just realizing that it would probably be helpful to our speakers and to everybody else if when you ask a question you let us know your name and what your major is or your school. So, okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes?
So I'm Nadina Ferreira. I'm from the People School of Business.
Great. Thanks.
And I just have a question. Like when you were talking about Thoreau, a lot of his ideas were really similar to Buddhism. You know, kind of overcoming yourself and restraining from desire.
Yes.
Is there any sort of
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I have to repeat the question for the silly recording. Talk about being technologically vulnerable, right? So many of Thoreau's ideas, especially in Professor Purdy's lecture, were similar to Buddhism, and you were wondering whether, in fact, there was a connection.
There is a connection. I think that for Thoreau, the line of influence was more through the philosophical tradition associated with Hindu civilization, and with the kind of the old Advaitic texts. The great sort of works that first reached the West in translation out of the Sanskrit were in Thoreau's library, and he was very interested in them. But I think the picture of the self, its problems and its goals, are deeply continuous between Buddhism and that tradition. In a certain way, Buddhism is a purifying effort within that. So absolutely, I think that he looked east in search of resources for kind of renovating the spiritual civilization he found himself in.
I unfortunately happen to know something about this. So the Bhagavad Gita, which is the text that I think Professor Purdy is referring to,
right.
He was possessed of the earliest translation of that by Charles Wilkins.
Yes.
Emerson was also possessed of that translation. They wrote small essays about how influential it was. They thought initially it was a Buddhist text. They only realized later that it was actually something larger. But many people theorize that where the idea of what Emerson and Thoreau, but more Emerson, call the world soul, is the idea in Hinduism of what's called the Atman, which is that soul which is both within us and others. Buddhism argues with that, but the basic idea of the interdependence of all things is a much stronger philosophical streak in Buddhism, and that's where we get the Buddhist influence. So there's a great set of books on that. I'll give you a bibliography if you're interested. Other questions? Oh, sorry, yes, over there.
this is, I guess, for Michelle.
Name and where you're from.
I'm Heather. I'm a graduate student in psychology and neuroscience here.
Excellent.
I'm wondering, when you mentioned sort of public hearings and how they're not really about hearing the public, and I guess I'm wondering, other than sort of voting with your dollars, like, you know, from a public perspective, how does one affect laws and policies?
So the question was, one of the things in Michelle's lectures was about public hearings are not really about hearing the public. So aside from voting with your dollars, what options do we have for affecting laws and public policy around food and the environment?
It's actually one of the areas that I like to think about and work in the most. And the way a lot of these permitting processes work is that the permit applicant will work with the government agency for that particular permit. There'll be a lot of back and forth to help develop the actual application. The permit applicant will then finalize that application, submit it. Then there'll be some more back and forth where a draft permit is developed, and it's that draft permit that gets circulated for public review and comment. And so by that time, there's been an enormous investment of work and resources, both on the part of the government and on the part of the permit applicant, and there's not a lot of incentive for changing things after that point. What can be very helpful is when citizens come together and pool their resources, and to the extent that it's possible, hire an expert, work with a scientist within a community, or hire a technical consulting agency to do their own independent review, and then use that as the basis for comments. The other, though more practical way of doing that is to recognize that even though laws and regulations exist on the books, they're heavily influenced by political sentiment. So I always encourage citizens, even though the hearing officers or the public notice about the hearing will say, we're not interested in what you think, to go ahead and do that anyway, and to make sure that newspapers, that other forms of social media, and that your elected representatives have copies of your points, or you can make a phone call if you don't feel like writing it up, and make a phone call and say what you think the outcome should be. And most of the time, if there's enough political interest, community level interest, that will involve a different process that's not necessarily something that ever gets written about. It's not something that is formulated within the regulations themselves, but nonetheless ends up becoming a determining factor in the way a lot of permits are written.
I wonder if I could just amplify Michelle's response to the question. I don't know how prominently this came out in the introduction, but Michelle is innovating a very important course over at the law school on the legal barriers the local food movement encounters, and I think implicitly the kind of legal reform agenda that the local food movement could develop. And I think this is incredibly important because though I was sort of wearing the history of ideas hat during the presentation, ideas about why it might feel good and even be a kind of psychic and spiritual achievement to engage the natural world in a certain way are really doomed to be nothing but sentimental unless there is a political economic context where they can flourish in more than a boutique way. That is just the case. And in the same way, to use a historical example, that the Sierra Club members, because they were so moved by these kind of high-flown sentiments connected with the High Sierra, committed themselves to changing public policy and redirecting it from an agenda of getting all federal lands out of government hands into productive private hands right away so that they would be timbered or farmed or mined, into our current model of permanently preserving and dedicating federal land for recreational uses like the ones they valued so much, so that people could keep having these John Muir-style epiphanies. There has to be a similar scale of reorientation in the legal frame that makes the economic frame in which farming happens. And that requires a political movement and a legal agenda. So it's just an incredibly important direction to take the questions.
Unfortunately, we have to stop. I would just only add that part of what's important about this class is that it inspires people to take further classes or think further about specific issues like the legal barriers that the local food movement encounters, of which we got a slight taste today. And we've had questions from Trinity, Business, and Neuroscience, all pushing us in some interesting ways to think about one key point that Professors Nolan and Purdy have outlined for us. The way I would put it is laws can be necessary boundaries, laws can be unnecessary boundaries, and laws can be harmful boundaries. And I think that's a way for us to continue to conceptualize this question as we move forward. They will be joining us for dinner, right?
Yes.
Good. We feed you, among other things. So please join me in thanking Professors Nolan and Purdy.
Thank you all.